The paper shook in Rosa Chandler's hands, not from the wind that tore across the open porch of the Finley ranch, not from the cold that had settled over Colfax County like a burial shroud in the October of 1883. It shook because she had read the words printed on it a dozen times on the ride out from Cimarron, and she still could not find a merciful way to say them aloud. She had rehearsed sentences the whole length of that 12-mile road, watching the red mesa country roll past her mare's ears, turning phrases over in her mind like stones she hoped might yield something softer underneath. None of them had. And now Jasper Finley was standing in his own doorway, hat in hand, looking at her with eyes the color of creek water in summer, and the words were all gone. He was taller than she had expected. The man at the land office in Cimarron had described him as a rancher, and she had built a picture in her mind of someone weathered past all feeling, hard-edged as the country itself. But Jasper Finley stood there with his dark hair pushed back from a face that still carried something unguarded in it, something that had not yet decided to close itself off from the world, and Rosa felt the letter in her hand like a brand. "Miss Chandler," he said, and his voice was careful. He had seen the envelope. Men in 1883, New Mexico Territory recognized the shape of legal correspondence the way they recognized storm clouds forming over the Cimarron Range. "You rode all the way out from town." "I did," she said. "Mr. Finley, I work for Alderman Pruitt at the land office. He sent me because he said he knows you, and he thought a familiar connection might—" She stopped. Her mouth had gone dry as trail dust. "I have a letter here that concerns the deed to your property." Something shifted behind his eyes. Not panic. Not yet. Something quieter and more terrible than panic. The look of a man who has been waiting for a blow and has just heard the first whistle of it through the air. "You had better come inside," he said. She would remember later, when everything had changed between them in ways she could not have predicted on that porch, that the moment she stepped through his door was the moment her life divided itself into before and after. She did not know it then. She only knew that the kitchen smelled of coffee and pine smoke, that a border collie lifted its head from the hearth rug and regarded her without alarm, and that she was about to shatter something in this man that she did not know how to put back together. Rosa had come to New Mexico Territory 6 months earlier, in the spring of 1883, on a stagecoach from Santa Fe. She was 26 years old, the daughter of a schoolteacher father and a mother who had died of fever when Rosa was 12, and she had the kind of practical competence that tends to develop in women who have been managing households and smaller people since childhood. She could read Latin and could also butcher a chicken. She could write a clear letter and ride a horse without particular grace, but with considerable endurance. These qualities had recommended her to Alderman Pruitt, who needed a clerk at the Cimarron land office, and who had learned, after 2 failed attempts at hiring men from the region, that a woman with a talent for paperwork and a spine of quiet iron was worth more than 2 posturing cowboys who spent half their days settling arguments in the street. Pruitt was a red-faced, well-meaning man of 50 who wore the same brown vest every day of the year and kept a jar of peppermint candies on his desk that he offered to everyone who came through his door. Rosa had liked him immediately. She had learned the filing systems, the surveying notations, the particular language of land grants and deed transfers that governed who owned what in Colfax County. She had made herself indispensable in a way that was invisible and thorough, the way useful women often did, by simply doing the work so completely that no one could imagine the office without her. And then in late September of that year, a packet of documents had arrived from a law firm in Santa Fe, and Pruitt had opened it at his desk while Rosa organized survey maps, and she had heard him set down his coffee cup with unusual care. "Miss Chandler," he had said, "I need you to read something and tell me if I am understanding it correctly." She had read it. She had read it 3 times, and each time she understood it more clearly, and each time it became more terrible. The Finley Ranch, All 4,600 acres of it in the Cimarron River Valley was the subject of a competing land grant claim. The Maxwell land grant, that enormous and endlessly contested tract of territory in northeastern New Mexico, had been the source of legal warfare for more than a decade. Settlers and ranchers across the region had been caught in the struggle between the original grant holders, various speculative land companies, and the settlers who had built lives on land they believed they had purchased fairly. Jasper Finley's father, Edmund Finley, had bought 800 acres in 1871 and spent 12 years building it into a working cattle ranch. When Edmund died of a heart attack in the spring of 1882, the land had passed to his son Jasper, who had continued expanding it through legal purchase from the Territorial Land Office. Jasper had bought 3 additional parcels, improved the water rights, built a new barn, and increased his herd to nearly 300 head of cattle. Every one of those legal purchases, according to the documents now in Rosa's hands, was potentially void. The Santa Fe law firm, representing a reorganized offshoot of the Maxwell Land Grant Company, was asserting that the original boundaries of the Maxwell Grant encompassed the Finley property, that Edmund Finley's original deed was irregularly recorded, and that all subsequent transfers were therefore invalid. The letter gave Jasper Finley 60 days to present counter-documentation or vacate the property. Pruitt had sat behind his desk looking genuinely pained. "I know his father," he had said. "I knew Edmund, good man, paid his taxes, recorded his deeds right here in this office, never gave anyone a moment's trouble. He had pressed his lips together. This is the Maxwell trouble coming around again. It has ruined half a dozen families in this county." "What can be done?" Rosa had asked. Pruitt had pulled off his glasses and rubbed his eyes. "He needs a lawyer. He needs to get to Santa Fe and find the original survey documentation, which should be in the territorial archives if anyone has not tampered with it, and he needs to file a counterclaim within 60 days. If he has the right papers, he may be able to hold the land. If he does not," Pruitt had shaken his head. "Someone needs to ride out and tell him. I would go myself, but my wife is ill and the doctor says I cannot leave her. I thought, you have a good head, Rosa. You would be steady. He needs to hear this from someone steady, not some clerk who will fall apart or some marshal who will make it sound like an eviction notice." And so Rosa had ridden out to the Finley ranch on a gray October morning, with the legal documents in her saddlebag, and 12 miles of mesa country and wild grass between herself and a man she had never met, to deliver news that might take everything he had. Inside the kitchen, she laid the documents on his table and told him clearly and without softening what they said. She watched his face as she explained the Maxwell Grant history, the competing claim, the 60-day window. He did not interrupt her. He sat with both hands flat on the table, and she could see the muscles working in his jaw, and she knew he was holding himself very still in the way that people do when they are afraid that if they move at all they will break. When she finished, there was silence except for the dog shifting on the hearth rug and the fire popping. "How solid is the claim?" he asked finally. "I cannot tell you it is frivolous," she said, because she had promised herself she would be honest. "The Maxwell Grant litigation is genuinely complex. There have been cases where legitimate buyers lost their property, but Mr. Pruitt believes that if your father's original survey documentation is intact in the territorial archives in Santa Fe, you have a strong case. The land office records here show proper filing. That matters." "My father was meticulous," Jasper said, and there was something in his voice that cracked slightly on the word meticulous, as if the quality he was describing was also a grief. "Then you have a fighting chance," Rosa said. "But you need a lawyer and you need to go to Santa Fe and you need to do it quickly." He looked at her then, really looked at her, with those Creekwater eyes that she was already, against her better judgment, noticing in too much detail. "You rode 12 miles to tell me this." "Yes." "That was kind," he said. "You did not have to do it kindly." She had not expected that. She had expected anger or despair or the tight-lipped shutdown of a man who would not allow himself to be seen struggling. She had not expected him to notice that she had tried to be kind. "Mr. Finley," she said, folding her hands in her lap, "what will you do?" He was quiet for a long moment. Outside, a horse moved in the corral, and the wind came under the door with a smell of coming cold. "I have a ranch to run," he said. 300 head of cattle that need to be moved to winter pasture before the month is out. A hand who just quit on me last week. And now I have to go to Santa Fe and fight a legal battle I do not know how to fight. He looked down at his hands. "My father spent everything he had building this place. My mother is buried on that rise out there." He nodded toward the east window. "I was born in this house." Rosa felt something tighten in her chest that was not quite sympathy, because sympathy was too simple a word for it. It was something closer to the awareness that she was sitting in the presence of a kind of love she understood very well, the love of a place that is also a person, the love of ground that holds the dead you have lost. "I can help you," she said. The words surprised her almost as much as they surprised him. "Miss Chandler, I know the land office systems. I know the filing procedures. I know what documentation you need and where it should be, because I have spent 6 months learning every corner of Colfax County's land records. If you will let me, I can help you build the counterclaim. I have a week's leave owed to me that Mr. Pruitt will approve, and I can write letters and organize documents faster than most lawyers' clerks." She paused. "You would still need a proper lawyer for the Santa Fe filing, but I can help you prepare what he will need." Jasper Finley looked at her for a very long moment. The afternoon light was going amber through the kitchen window, laying bars of gold across the table between them. "Why?" he asked. It was a simple word, but he asked it with a directness that told her he genuinely wanted to know. Rosa thought about that. She had several answers. She could say that it was professional obligation, which was true but insufficient. She could say that she believed in the justice of his case, which was also true. She could say that Pruitt had asked her to be steady for him, which was accurate. But the truest answer, the one she sat with for just a moment before she spoke, was something more uncomfortable. That she had sat across from this man for 20 minutes, listening to him hold himself together while the world tried to fall apart around him, and she found that she could not simply ride back to Cimarron and leave him to manage it alone. "Because it is right," she said, "and because I can." He made her coffee. That seemed important to him, that he should be the host and she should be the guest, that the ordinary ceremony of hospitality should continue even while the extraordinary and terrible had just walked through his door. He found cups and poured from a pot that had been sitting on the stove, and the coffee was strong and bitter and warm, and Rosa wrapped both hands around the cup and felt the October chill ease out of her fingers. "My foreman's name is Cal Briggs," Jasper said, sitting down across from her again. "He is the one person who knows this land as well as I do. If I have to go to Santa Fe, he can manage the cattle movement, but I will need to give him clear instruction and I will need to be back before the deep cold hits." "How long is the ride to Santa Fe?" 4 days by horse, 3 by stage if you catch the right connections. The stage out of Cimarron goes to Springer, then you take the connecting line south." He paused. "Have you been to Santa Fe?" "Once, when I arrived in the territory. I came through on my way to Cimarron." He nodded slowly, and she could see him organizing the problem in his mind the way a practical man does, breaking the impossible into parts and lining them up. "The territorial archives are in the palace of the governors on the plaza," he said. "My father mentioned once that he kept a copy of the original survey in a strongbox, but I have never found it. The house has been searched more than once since he died." He frowned. "I would not have known where to look." "We look at the land office copies first," Rosa said. "Everything filed in Cimarron should correspond to the territorial record. If there is a discrepancy, that is where the Maxwell Company's lawyers will attack. If the records match, and they should because your father's filing was proper, then we have a foundation." Jasper set down his cup. "You know a great deal about this." I have spent 6 months reading every deed filing in Colfax County going back to the 1860s, she said. The Maxwell Grant dispute runs through almost all of them. I know the history. She paused. Your father filed his original deed in 1871 under the Surveyor General's authority. That was the proper procedure at the time. The Maxwell Company is arguing that the Surveyor General's authority was itself subordinate to the original grant boundaries, which is a legal question that has gone back and forth in the federal courts for 15 years. Jasper leaned back and crossed his arms, not in hostility but in the posture of a man who is taking in a great deal of information and trying to hold it all level. You are telling me this may not be winnable. I am telling you it is complicated, Rosa said. But complicated does not mean unwinnable. It means you need good legal representation and solid documentation. She met his eyes directly. What I can promise you is that I will help you find and organize everything that helps your case. What happens in the Santa Fe courts after that is out of both our hands. He looked at her for a moment that stretched longer than conversation required. All right, Miss Chandler, he said at last. I accept your offer, but I want to be clear about something. He sat forward, elbows on the table. I am not a man who takes help easily. I am not, he stopped, seemed to choose his next words with care. My father built this place from nothing. I grew up watching him do it. There is something in me that does not like to ask for assistance, and I am telling you that plainly so you do not mistake it for ingratitude. I did not offer to be thanked, Rosa said simply. I offered to be useful. Something shifted in his expression. She could not have named exactly what it was, except that it moved through his eyes and was gone, like a fish turning in clear water. Then we understand each other, he said. They did not understand each other at all, not yet. That understanding would take weeks of shared work and shared danger and a great deal of honesty that neither of them had planned to offer. But the agreement was made, and the fire burned low in the hearth, and Rosa Chandler stayed. She did not go back to Cimarron that evening. The ride was too long in the dark and the temperature had dropped sharply after sunset. Jasper offered her the small bedroom that had been his mother's, plainly but decently furnished, with a quilt that smelled of cedar and dried lavender. He was careful with her comfort in the way of a man who had been raised to be a considerate host and who was aware of the proprieties, offering her supper from what he had, which was beans and salt pork and cornbread, and asking no questions about her life that she had not volunteered. Rosa, for her part, asked him questions about the ranch. Not the legal problem, not the threat, the actual daily operation of the place. How many hands did he have? How was the cattle market in 1883? What was the water situation in a dry year on the Cimarron River? She asked because she was genuinely curious, and also because she could see that talking about the work of the ranch was the thing that steadied him, the way that describing a familiar road steadies a lost person. Jasper talked. He talked about the cattle operation with the focused enthusiasm of a man who loves what he does, about the Hereford bulls he had brought in that spring to improve the herd, about the new windmill he had installed at the North Water Tank, about the particular quality of the grass in the river bottom that put weight on cattle better than almost anywhere in the county. He talked about the land with the specific, sensory knowledge of someone who has walked every acre of it in every season, who knows where the soil changes from red clay to sandy loam, and where the best shelter from a north wind can be found. Rosa listened, and somewhere between the supper table and the fire burning to coals, she formed a clear picture of a man who had built something real and true out here, something worth fighting for, and the injustice of what the Maxwell Company's lawyers were attempting to do settled in her chest like a coal of its own. In the morning, she asked to see the existing ranch records. Jasper led her to a small room off the main parlor that had functioned as his father's office. There was a roll-top desk, a filing cabinet of the kind used by Western businesses in the 1870s and 1880s, a shelf of account ledgers, and 2 drawers of loose correspondence. Rosa took off her jacket, hung it over the chair back, and began. She worked methodically. She was looking for the original deed documentation, any correspondence with the Surveyor General's office, the survey plat maps, records of subsequent property purchases, tax receipts, and any letters that mentioned the Maxwell Grant dispute by name. Jasper sat on a stool in the doorway and watched her work, and she was aware of his watching in the particular way you are aware of something without looking directly at it. "Your father kept good records," she said after about an hour, not looking up from the filing cabinet. "He was a former schoolteacher," Jasper said, "before we came west." She did look up at that. A schoolteacher. "He taught mathematics in St. Louis for 6 years. Then my mother's health needed a drier climate and they came west." Something crossed his face briefly. "She died anyway, fever in 1878, but she had 5 good years out here first and she loved it. She used to say the sky was bigger than any room she had ever been in." Rosa felt the particular ache of that. "My father was also a school teacher," she said. Jasper looked at her with what she could only describe as recognition, the look of someone who has just heard an unexpected echo. "Is that so?" "In Ohio. He taught English literature. He died 4 years ago. Pneumonia." She paused. "And then I came west." She returned to the files, because there was work to be done, and because there was a kind of intimacy in what had just passed between them that she was not ready to examine at close range. But she felt it, the way you feel a door opening in a room you thought was sealed. By noon she had found the original deed. It was exactly as Prude had hoped, a properly executed document from 1871, signed by the Surveyor General's designated agent, with the survey boundaries clearly defined using meets and bounds notation from established natural landmarks. More importantly, she found a letter from the Surveyor General's office dated 1872 confirming receipt and proper registration of the Finley claim. That letter was worth its weight in gold. She held it up. "Mr. Finley." He was across the room before she had lowered her arm. He took the letter and read it twice, and she watched the relief move through him like water moving through dry ground, not flooding, not dramatic, but thorough. "This proves the filing was legitimate," she said. "It proves it," he agreed. His voice had changed. It had a quality of warmth in it that had not been there before. "You found this in 2 hours. Your father filed everything in date order," she said. "It made it easy." She looked up at him. He was close. Closer than she had expected, because he had come quickly across the room, and now they were both leaning over the desk with the papers between them and the morning light coming through the window. She could see the line of his jaw and the way his hair fell across his forehead, and she catalogued these details with an internal severity, the way you deal firmly with something that is starting to become inconvenient. She stepped back and picked up the next document. "We need copies of everything," she said professionally. "Certified copies that a lawyer can use. And we need to compile a chronological record of every land purchase, tax payment, and correspondence with any government office. When we get to Santa Fe, a good lawyer can build a defense around the paper trail." "We," he said. She had used the word without thinking. Now she looked at him directly. "I said I would help you. You said you had a week's leave. A week is enough time to get to Santa Fe, file with a lawyer, and get back. If we leave tomorrow," she paused, "unless you have reason not to want my company on the road." There was a long silence. The border collie appeared in the doorway, looked at them both with calm intelligence, and turned around and left. "No," Jasper said. "I have every reason to want it." They left the following morning at first light. Rosa on her gray mare and Jasper on a big bay gelding named August, with the documents packed in an oilskin case in Jasper's saddlebag and provisions for a 4-day ride. Cal Briggs, the foreman, had been briefed the previous evening. A rangy, weathered man of 40 with a sun-cracked face and the quiet competence of someone who has been reading cattle country all his life. He had shaken Rosa's hand with the deliberate courtesy of someone who had decided to trust her based on Jasper's willingness to do so, and then he had gone back to his own preparations without a wasted word. The morning was cold and clear. the kind of October clarity that makes the Cimarron Range look painted against the sky. They rode south, staying on the main road that ran down toward Springer, where they could pick up the stage connection. Jasper set a steady pace, not racing, not dawdling, the pace of a man who knows how to cover ground without exhausting his horse. For the first hour they rode mostly in silence, but it was not an uncomfortable silence. Rosa had the sense of two people who are still learning the shape of each other's company, testing it like uncertain ice. The country opened out around them, red and gold and immense, with the mountains to the west catching the morning sun on their upper ridges. "Tell me more about the Maxwell Grant," Jasper said eventually. "The full history. I know pieces of it, but not the whole," Rosa told him. She told him about Lucian Maxwell, who had assembled the enormous land grant in the 1840s and 1850s through marriage and purchase and political maneuvering, eventually claiming over 1.5 million acres in northeastern New Mexico, the largest private land holding in American history. She told him how Maxwell had sold the grant in 1870 to a group of British and Dutch investors who formed the Maxwell Land Grant Company, and how the new owners, discovering that hundreds of settlers had been living on parts of the grant for years under the honest belief that they were on public land, had attempted to evict them. She told him about the Colfax County War in the 1870s, the violence and the legal chaos that had left the region scarred, about the families who had lost everything and the families who had fought back, and the federal courts that had gone back and forth on the question of the grant's actual boundaries for more than a decade. "My father came west in 1871, right in the middle of all of that," Jasper said. He knew there was dispute about the land, but the Surveyor General's office told him the parcel he was buying was clearly outside the contested grant boundaries. "They were right at the time," Rosa said. "The problem is that the courts have since redrawn those boundaries several times. The Maxwell Company keeps finding legal arguments to extend them." She paused. "It is not a simple case of dishonesty on your father's part or the government's part. It is a genuine legal tangle that has destroyed honest families. The injustice of it is not that your father did anything wrong. It is that he did everything right and the rules changed around him afterward." Jasper was quiet for a stretch of road. "And the Santa Fe ring," he said. "You know about that?" She did. The Santa Fe ring was the name given to the network of lawyers, politicians, and land speculators who had used their connections to the territorial government to manipulate land disputes across New Mexico in their own favor. Several members of the ring had interests in the Maxwell Grant Company's reorganized successors. It was one of the darker open secrets of New Mexico territory in the 1880s. "I know about it," she said carefully. "Which is why you need a lawyer who is not connected to it. Do you know of one?" Prout mentioned a man named Thomas Selden in Santa Fe. "He has represented settlers against Maxwell Grant claims before, and he does not have ring connections. He is expensive." She hesitated. "How are your finances, Mr. Finley? I am sorry to ask directly, but it matters." Jasper did not flinch at the question. "I have savings. Not unlimited, but I have run this ranch carefully. I can afford a lawyer." He paused. "For a time. If the case drags on for years, as these things sometimes do, then we need to make the case as strong as possible from the beginning so it does not drag on," Rosa said firmly. He looked at her sideways with a slight expression she could not quite read. "You say we again." "It is an efficient pronoun," she said, keeping her voice level. She heard him make a sound that might have been a laugh, quickly suppressed. They stopped at noon in a hollow where a creek ran cold and clear, letting the horses drink and eat a rest while Rosa and Jasper sat on the bank and ate the bread and dried meat she had packed that morning. The silence was different now, easier, with the water sound running through it. "How long have you been in New Mexico?" he asked. 6 months, since April." "You came alone?" "I did." He considered this. "That takes something." "It takes a lack of better options, mostly," she said honestly. I was clerking in a courthouse in Columbus, Ohio, and I was very good at my job and very invisible, and one day I was offered a position here through a placement agency that Prout used, and I thought. She stopped and looked at the creek. I thought that if I was going to be invisible, I might as well be invisible somewhere with more sky. He said nothing for a moment. Then, "You are not invisible." It was said so simply and directly that she felt it land somewhere behind her sternum before she could organize a response. She managed a level look. "That is very kind." "It is just accurate," he said, and picked up his bread again, apparently finished with the subject, leaving her to sit with the particular warmth of the thing he had said, and the entirely unhelpful awareness that she was finding this man more interesting with every hour that passed. They reached Springer by the evening of the second day and caught the southbound stage the following morning. The stage was crowded, carrying 4 other passengers: a dry goods merchant heading to Albuquerque, a Mexican woman traveling with her teenage daughter to visit family in Santa Fe, and a young law clerk named Perry who talked incessantly about railroad development and managed to direct most of his talking at Rosa with an admiring persistence that she found exhausting. Jasper, who had taken the seat beside her by the natural arrangement of being her companion, spent most of the stage ride alternating between watching the country through the window and watching the young law clerk with an expression of neutral patience that Rosa suspected, based on occasional small things: the slight tension in his shoulder, the way he answered one of Perry's questions directed at her before she could, was not entirely neutral. When Perry finally fell asleep against the window of the stage, his mouth slightly open, Rosa allowed herself a quiet look at Jasper and found him already looking at her. "He likes you," Jasper said. "He likes the sound of his own voice, and I happen to be sitting next to it," Rosa said, the slight expression again. "He is not entirely wrong to admire you," Jasper said, with a care in his voice that suggested he was choosing his words the way you choose footing on uncertain ground. "I find that He stopped. "What?" Rosa asked. He looked back at the window. "I find that I am glad you came." She let that sit between them without examination, because examining it at close range in a crowded stage seemed like a guaranteed way to make it complicated, and she had enough complicated things to carry at the moment. But she let herself feel it, that small, warm declaration, quietly and without fuss. Santa Fe in October of 1883 was a busy, layered, beautiful city that smelled of pinon smoke and roasting chilies and horse. The plaza at its center was surrounded by the long, low adobe buildings that had been the seat of New Mexico's government since the Spanish colonial period, and the Palace of the Governors, the long portal-fronted building on the north side of the square, housed the territorial archives that Rosa needed. She had been here briefly in April and had not had time to appreciate it. Now, despite the urgency of their purpose, she felt the city's particular character pressing in on her with something like delight. They took rooms at a respectable boarding house on the south side of the plaza, a clean and well-run establishment kept by a widow named Mrs. Ortega, who served excellent postle at dinner and asked no questions about the business of her guests. Jasper paid for 2 separate rooms without comment, and Rosa appreciated his straightforward good manners. The following morning, they went first to find Thomas Selden. Selden's office was on a side street 2 blocks from the plaza, a pair of rooms in an adobe building with a hand-painted sign and shelves of law books so densely packed they seemed to be holding up the walls. Selden himself was a compact, bearded man of about 45 with sharp brown eyes and ink on his fingers, and the manner of someone who has seen a great many things done badly and has opinions about all of them. He read the Maxwell Company's letter and the counter-documentation Rosa and Jasper presented for exactly 7 minutes, during which time he did not speak at all, and then he set them down and looked at Jasper. "Where did you get this 1872 confirmation letter?" he said. "It was in my father's files," Jasper said. "My companion found it. Selden looked at Rosa with a reassessment that was almost comical in its directness. "You work at the Cimarron Land Office." "I do." "Can you certify copies of the corresponding registry entry there?" "I can obtain certified copies from Mr. Prout, yes." Selden picked up the 1872 letter again and held it as if weighing it. "This is significant. The Maxwell Company's current argument depends in part on the claim that the original Finley deed was registered through an improperly constituted authority. This letter from the Surveyor General's office directly contradicts that position." He set it down. "I'm not going to tell you this case is easy. The Maxwell litigation is never easy, but this is a strong foundation. I can file a counterclaim and a request for injunctive relief to prevent any eviction while the case is heard. That buys time." He looked at Jasper. "I will need a retainer of $40 and my fee is $15 a day for active court appearances." Jasper did not hesitate. "Agreed." Selden nodded crisply. "Then let us go to the Territorial Archives." The archives of the territorial government were housed in a series of rooms in the Palace of the Governors, managed by an archivist named Mr. Delgado, who was meticulous and slightly mistrustful of lawyers, but who responded warmly to Rosa's careful, respectful approach. She knew how to talk to archivists, which was to say she knew how to demonstrate that she genuinely understood and respected the material she was asking to see. And within an hour she and Mr. Delgado were working through the survey records of Colfax County land filings from the early 1870s like two people who speak the same language. They found the Finley filing. It was intact, properly indexed, and matched the copies from the ranch files exactly. Rosa felt a surge of something fierce and satisfied in her chest. "There it is," she said. Jasper was standing beside her. He put his hand down on the table next to hers, not touching, but close, and she felt the warmth of him and looked at the record instead of at him, because looking at him right now felt dangerous in a way she had been managing carefully for 3 days and was finding increasingly difficult to maintain. Selden ordered certified copies of everything. He spent the afternoon drafting the counterclaim filing while Rosa cross-referenced documents and identified every point of correspondence between the Territorial Archive record, the Cimarron Land Office records, and the original ranch documentation. It was detailed, painstaking work, the kind she was genuinely good at, and she was aware of Jasper watching her from across the room with an attention that was no longer abstract. When they broke at late afternoon and stepped out of Selden's office into the cool Santa Fe air, Jasper stopped on the sidewalk and looked at her. "Rosa," he said. It was the first time he had used her given name. She felt it as clearly as a hand on her shoulder. "Yes, thank you," he said. "Not the formal thank you. The real one." He paused. "I have been thinking that I should say it properly. You did not have to come. You did not have to ride 12 miles to deliver bad news kindly. You did not have to spend your leave days in a lawyer's office in Santa Fe going through a stranger's land records." He stopped and looked past her at the plaza for a moment, and she could see him marshaling something. "I am not a man who finds these things easy to say, but I want you to know that I see what you have done." Rosa stood with the warm October evening light on her face and felt herself standing at the edge of something she had not planned and could no longer pretend was not there. "You are not a stranger anymore," she said quietly. He looked at her. The light was going gold and the piñon smoke was sweet on the air, and she held his gaze the way you hold something you know is important. "No," he agreed. "I am not." They ate dinner together at a restaurant near the plaza that served good beef and red chili sauce and brought their coffee hot and strong, and they talked until the restaurant was nearly empty. They talked about books. It turned out he had read more than she expected, that the ranch house shelves held Dickens and Scott and a well-read copy of Shakespeare's histories. They talked about the territory, about what kind of place it was becoming as the railroad pushed further in, and the old patterns of open range and loose legal definition gave way to something more structured and more contested. They talked about what they each hoped for in a future that neither of them described too specifically, dancing around the edges of it in the way of two people who are starting to wonder if their futures might share a geography. When he walked her back to the boarding house, he took her hand to help her over a rough patch of cobblestone in the plaza, and then held it a half step longer than the helping required. She felt every moment of that half step. When he let go, they were at the door of the boarding house, and he looked at her with an expression that was careful and warm and uncertain all at once. "Good night, Rosa," he said. "Good night, Jasper," she said. His name on her lips felt like a beginning. The following day, Selden filed the counterclaim with the territorial court. He was efficient and precise, and Rosa found herself respecting his competence the way you respect the work of someone who genuinely knows what they are doing. The filing requested injunctive relief against any eviction or dispossession of the Finley property pending full hearing of the competing claims, and Selden was cautiously optimistic that the strength of the documentary record would support the injunction. "The Maxwell Company's lawyers are good," he told them, leaning back in his chair. "But they are working from a weak foundation in this particular case. Your father's documentation is clean, Mr. Finley, cleaner than most of what I see in these disputes. If the judge is fair, and I believe this particular judge is, the injunction should hold." "What is the timeline for full hearing?" Jasper asked. 8 to 12 months, possibly longer." "These cases move slowly." Jasper absorbed this. "That is a long time to have my ranch under legal cloud." "It is," Selden said simply. "But during that time, with the injunction in place, you cannot be removed. Your operations can continue. The cloud is a discomfort, not a disaster." "And what are the odds of winning at full hearing?" Selden looked at him directly. "With what Miss Chandler found in those files, better than even. I would not take the case otherwise." They spent one more day in Santa Fe, during which Jasper met with Selden twice more, and Rosa obtained an additional certified copy of everything for her own records, and then they prepared to begin the journey back north. The night before they left, they sat together in the small garden at the back of the boarding house after dinner, where Mrs. Ortega grew herbs in clay pots and a lantern hung on a hook from the portal, and the stars over Santa Fe were enormous and very close. "I keep thinking about what you said," Jasper said, looking at the stars. "About being invisible, coming west to be invisible somewhere with more sky." "I should not have said that," Rosa said, because it had been more honest than she usually allowed herself to be with people she barely knew, except she no longer barely knew him. "No, I am glad you did." He turned to look at her. "Because I have been thinking that you are the least invisible person I have been in a room with in a very long time." He paused. "I have been not invisible exactly, but closed. Since my father died and the ranch became all mine, I have been so focused on making it work that I stopped being someone who thought about anything else. And then you knocked on my door with papers that could take it all away, and I thought—" He stopped again. "What did you think?" Rosa asked softly. "I thought that I was going to have to face the worst thing alone," he said. And instead, he reached across the space between their chairs and took her hand, and this time he held it with full intention, with nothing in the gesture that could be mistaken for something else. "Instead, I have not been alone for a single moment of it." Rosa looked down at her hand in his, at his thumb tracing a slow, careful arc across her knuckles, and then she looked up at his face in the lantern light and stopped managing the distance between them. "Jasper," she said. "I know it is fast," he said, and his voice was careful and serious. "I know you are going back to Cimarron, and I am going back to the ranch, and our lives are what they are. I am not asking you for anything you are not. I am not afraid of fast," she said. "I am afraid of dishonest, and I want to be honest with you." She turned her hand over and laced her fingers through his. "I came to your door to deliver bad news, and I stayed because I wanted to help you. But somewhere between your kitchen table and the territorial archives, I stopped helping you because it was right and started helping you because—" She stopped. "Because what?" he said quietly. "Because I cannot imagine not," she said. "Because the thought of riding back to Cimarron and going back to my desk and never knowing how this ends for you is—" She shook her head. "I have been practical all my life, Jasper. I have been sensible and useful and careful. And I am sitting here holding your hand in a garden in Santa Fe, and none of those words feel adequate." He was looking at her with something in his expression that had not been there when she first knocked on his door, something open and warm and certain. He leaned forward and kissed her very gently once, with the care of a man who understands that some things matter too much to rush, and then he drew back and looked at her. "I want you to come back," he said. "Not just to Cimarron, to the ranch. I want to—" he seemed to choose the next word from among several. "I want to court you properly, Rosa. If you are willing." She felt the warmth of it spread through her like the first good fire of winter. "I am willing," she said. The ride north was different from the ride south. Not the landscape, which was still the same red mesa country running up to the mountains, not the horses, not the roads. But the atmosphere between them was different in the particular way of two people who have spoken honestly, and are now traveling in new territory of the emotional kind, which is both more uncertain and more alive than any country they have physically crossed. They rode closer together without planning to. They talked more easily about smaller things, about his dogs and her favorite books, about the particular qualities of New Mexico autumn light, about what Cal Briggs would have done with the cattle in his absence. Jasper told her about growing up on the ranch, about learning to rope from a Mexican vaquero named Santos who had worked for his father, and who had more patience than any man Jasper had ever known, about the summer when he was 16, and he and Santos had ridden the full perimeter of the ranch in a single long day just to prove they could. Rosa told him about her father's house in Columbus, about the smell of it, books and pipe tobacco, and something indefinable that was just the house itself, and how she still sometimes dreamed she was in it and woke up disoriented by the different smell of wherever she actually was. She told him about the courthouse job, about the sense of doing good work in a way that was completely invisible, that no one thanked or even named. She told him about the moment she had read the land office advertisement in a newspaper and felt something shift in her chest that she could only describe as recognition, a sense that there was something in the description of the place and the job that she was supposed to be heading toward. "Supposed to," he repeated. "You believe in that kind of thing, meant to be." "I believe that some choices feel right in a way that other choices don't," she said carefully. "Whether that is fate or simply good instinct, I cannot say. But yes, I suppose I do believe in it in some form." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I am glad you believed it, about this particular job." She smiled at the road ahead. "So am I." They arrived back at the Finley Ranch on the evening of the 5th day, dusty and road-weary, and in that particular state of travel tired that makes familiar ground feel more beautiful than it ever does in daily life. Cal Briggs met them in the yard with the news that the cattle had been moved successfully to the winter pasture, and that nothing had broken or burned down in their absence, delivered with the dry satisfaction of a man who took pride in his competence. Jasper shook his hand and thanked him, and Briggs looked at Rosa with a slight raise of his eyebrow that conveyed something complicated, and was suppressed before it became anything identifiable. Rosa stayed 2 more days at the ranch before returning to Cimarron. She told herself it was because there were additional documents to organize and copy before she rode back, which was true, but it was also true that she was not ready to leave. She woke early on those mornings and made coffee in the ranch kitchen, and watched the sunrise come over the eastern horizon with the border collie sitting beside her chair, and felt the extraordinary ordinary quality of it, the simple peace of a place that was starting to feel like somewhere she belonged. Jasper was different on his own ground. Not different from the man she had come to know, but expanded into it, fully himself in the way that some people are only when they are in the right place. He moved through the ranch with an ease and authority that was not performance but simple competence, knowing where everything was and what needed to be done next, checking on the horses and the remaining cattle with the attention of someone who genuinely cares about every living thing under his responsibility. He brought her coffee without being asked. He pointed out things he loved about the land, the way the morning light hit the mesa to the east, the particular red of the soil along the creek bank, the place on the south pasture fence where a family of foxes had made a den. On the last morning before she rode back, she stood on the porch in the early light and he came and stood beside her, and they were quiet together for a while with the country spreading out before them in the cool, clear morning. "Come back," he said. "I will," she said. "Soon." "Soon," she agreed. He walked her to the corral and saddled her mare with his own hands, checking the cinch and the stirrups with the thoroughness of someone who cares about the person who will be sitting in that saddle for the next 12 miles. When the horse was ready and she was mounted, he put his hand on her knee in a gesture that was tender and simple and enormously eloquent and looked up at her. "Rosa," he said. "I know," she said. He let his hand drop and she rode out, and she did not look back until she was at the gate. And when she looked back, he was still standing in the yard watching her, and she raised her hand and he raised his. The following weeks established a pattern that became the armature around which the rest of that autumn was built. Rosa returned to her work at the land office. She wrote to Thomas Selden twice a week, requesting updates on the case. She obtained the certified copies of the Cimarron land office records and sent them to Selden, and she maintained the careful documentary record that he had asked for. She did this because it was the right thing to do, and because it was the thing she was good at, but she was honest enough with herself to acknowledge that doing it also maintained a connection to Jasper's life that she found she needed the way you need steady ground. He wrote to her. That surprised her, or rather the quality of the letters surprised her. She had expected brief practical notes about the case. What she received were letters that were precise and warm and occasionally funny, that described the progress of the ranch in the shortening days of autumn with a particularity that told her he was seeing it all more vividly because he was describing it to her. He wrote about the cattle, about a horse that had taken a stone bruise and was being nursed back soundness, about the first real cold snap that came in November, and the way the creek developed a rim of ice along its edges in the morning that the dogs walked over and broke through for sport. He also wrote about the case. He had received word from Selden that the injunction had been granted, which meant the Maxwell Company could not touch the ranch while the full hearing was pending. The news should have been a relief, and it was, but Jasper wrote that he was finding the period of legal cloud harder than he expected, not because of practical disruption. The ranch operations continued normally, but because of a psychological weight he had not anticipated. The sense of living under uncertainty, of having something he had built and loved and inherited from his father held up to question by people who had never set foot on the land. Rosa read that passage of his letter 3 times and then sat at her desk in the land office with the letter in her lap, thinking about what it means to have something you love challenged, and about how that challenge isolates you, and about the fact that isolation was something she understood from the other direction. As someone who had spent years being very competent and very alone. She wrote back, "The case is going as well as it can go. Selden is capable and your documentation is strong. But more than that, and perhaps more important than that, the ranch is real. I have stood on it and walked it and I know what it is. It is a real place that your father built with real work and that you have grown with real care, and no legal cloud changes what it actually is. You are not living under uncertainty. You are living on your ranch. Do not let them make the question feel more real than the answer." He wrote back, "I have read that paragraph 4 times. I intend to keep it." In late November, she rode out to the ranch for a Sunday. It was a clear, cold day with a hard blue sky and the smell of snow on the wind from the mountains. Jasper met her in the yard, and they walked the property together in the afternoon. Not with any specific purpose, but with the pleasure of walking on known ground in good company. He showed her things he had not shown her on the first visit, the rock formation on the east ridge where he had built a small cairn for his mother, the place along the creek where the cottonwoods grew in a stand that went brilliant gold in autumn, and had already turned and dropped their leaves, leaving silver bark and a scattered carpet of gold on the frozen ground. He told her about his mother as they stood under the bare cottonwoods, not in the careful, edited way you describe someone to someone who does not know them, but in the full way you describe them when you trust the listener. His mother had been funny, apparently, in the dry, understated way of women who have survived difficult things and have emerged with perspective. She had loved this land with a fierceness that surprised everyone who met her, because she was small and quiet and gave the impression of someone gentle. But her love for the ranch was bedrock. She had learned to shoot before she learned to cook on an open fire, according to Jasper, and could read sign in the mud as well as any man on the property. "She sounds magnificent," Rosa said. "She was," he said simply. He paused, looking at the creek. "She would have liked you." Rosa felt that land gently in her chest. "How do you know?" "She liked people who did not waste words," he said, "and who did things because they were right, not because someone was watching." He looked at her. "You rode 12 miles to deliver bad news kindly and spent your leave in a lawyer's office in Santa Fe and have been writing letters to Selden every week for 2 months. I do not think you have thought once about whether anyone was watching." "I thought about it a little," she admitted. He laughed. It was a real laugh, full and warm, and she felt it like sunlight on cold ground. She had heard him laugh before, but not quite like that, not that fully. She thought, "I want to make him laugh like that again. I want to make him laugh like that for a very long time." He caught the expression on her face and his laughter quieted, and something else came into his eyes. He took a step toward her, and she did not step back, and the cold, clear afternoon held very still around them while he put his hand along her jaw and looked at her with the particular expression of a man who is entirely certain of something and is not afraid to show it. "I am falling in love with you," he said. "I thought you should know." "I thought you should know," she said, "that I have been falling in love with you since you made me coffee in your kitchen and said that what I had done was kind." He kissed her. The cottonwoods were bare and silver above them, and the cold was sharp, and the sky was the deep winter blue of the high country, and his arms were warm, and the kiss was long and unhurried and thorough in the way of people who have been heading toward each other through a complicated country, and have finally arrived. December brought snow to the Cimarron Range and news from Thomas Selden that the Maxwell Company's lawyers had filed a counter to the injunction, challenging the authority of the 1872 Surveyor General's letter on the grounds that the issuing agent's authority had been in dispute at the time. It was exactly the kind of legal maneuvering Selden had warned them about, and he had prepared for it. He filed a detailed response citing 3 precedent cases in which the territorial courts had upheld the Surveyor General's authority during the relevant period. He was cautiously confident. Rosa read Selden's letter at her desk in the land office and felt a flare of anger that surprised her with its heat. The Maxwell Company's lawyers were not stupid. They were systematically dismantling every supporting pillar of the counterclaim and would keep doing it until either the law ran out or the money did. She knew what they were doing. They were trying to make the case expensive enough and slow enough that Jasper would give up. He would not. She knew that with certainty, but she also knew that certainty alone could not pay Thomas Selden's fees indefinitely, and she began, sitting at her desk with the snow falling outside the land office window, to think about what else could be done. She went back to the Maxwell Grant documentation. She had been through it before, but now she went through it again with a different question in mind. Not just whether Jasper's claim was valid, but whether there were other settlers in the county whose cases, taken together, might form a collective challenge to the company's most aggressive boundary assertions. If multiple property owners could demonstrate a consistent pattern of properly registered deeds that the company was retroactively challenging, the case became not just Finley v. Maxwell Land Grant Company, but a county-wide pattern of bad faith litigation, which was a different kind of legal story and a much more visible one. She spent 3 evenings going through the filing records after the office closed, Prout having left her a key and a standing invitation to use the office for anything she needed. She found 6 other ranchers in the county whose deeds had been challenged by the same or similar Maxwell Grant successor claims in the past 3 years. She wrote careful notes on each case. Then she wrote to Jasper. His reply came within 4 days, which was faster than usual, which meant he had written back the same day he received her letter. He had been thinking along the same lines, it turned out. He had spoken with 2 of his neighboring ranchers, the Calhouns and the Mornos, both of whom were facing similar claims and neither of whom could individually afford the kind of sustained legal defense the company's lawyers were clearly prepared to mount. Could they share a lawyer? Could they coordinate a defense? Selden, when consulted, said yes, with qualifications. He could represent multiple clients in a coordinated defense, provided there were no conflicts of interest between their positions, which there were not. They were all straightforwardly opposing the same bad faith claims. It would reduce each client's individual cost, and it would change the character of the case in the territorial court from a single property dispute to a pattern challenge. That is significant, Selden wrote to Rosa. A pattern challenge changes the judge's calculus. He is no longer deciding a single boundary question. He is deciding whether the Maxwell Company's litigation strategy is itself operating in good faith. That is a question that can be answered in ways that protect the whole county. Rosa sent Selden's letter to Jasper with a note that said, "This is the right path. Talk to the Calhouns and the Mornos. Let me know who else will join." He wrote back, "You are remarkable. Also, I miss you." Also, the Calhouns and Mornos said yes, and there are 2 more families who may join. Also, I miss you. She read that letter twice, smiling at her desk in the land office with the December light going cold and early outside the window, and then she wrote back, "The coordinated defense is the right strategy. Also, I miss you too. Also, please tell the Calhouns and Mornos to bring every land document they have ever touched, in whatever state it is in, and I will organize it. Also, I miss you extremely." She rode out to the ranch for Christmas. It was not a difficult decision. Prute gave her 5 days' leave and clapped her on the shoulder with genuine warmth, and said something about justice in a dry voice that contained, she thought, rather more emotion than he was showing. Christmas at the Finley Ranch in 1883 was a small affair but a real one. Cal Briggs and his wife came for dinner on Christmas Day, along with 2 of the ranch hands and Santos, the old vaquero who had taught Jasper to rope, and who was now in his 60s, brown-faced and deliberate, with the quietly amused quality of someone who has lived long enough to know that most urgency turns out to be unnecessary. Santos shook Rosa's hand when they were introduced and regarded her with the calm assessment of someone who matters to Jasper's household and knows it. And then he said something in Spanish to Jasper that Jasper translated as he says, "You have sensible eyes," which Rosa took as the compliment it was clearly intended to be. Jasper had put a pine branch on the kitchen table with a bit of red ribbon on it. He had made a roast and a sweet potato pudding, and the kind of simple meal that is better than most elaborate ones because of what surrounds it. They ate and talked, and Santos told a long story in a mixture of Spanish and English about a cattle drive in 1869 that involved a flooded river, a lost mule, and a territorial deputy who had never seen a cow before arriving in New Mexico, and everyone around the table laughed until they were wiping their eyes. Later, after everyone had gone, Jasper and Rosa sat by the fire, and he reached into the pocket of his coat and produced a small package wrapped in brown paper. "I did not know what to give you," he said, "and then I thought that what I could give you was something useful." He paused, a little uncertain. "That sounds, I hope it does not sound." "I love useful," she said, and opened the paper. It was a pen, not an ordinary pen, a beautiful one, silver-barreled, engraved with a small pattern of leaves along the barrel, the kind of pen you use when the writing matters. She held it and looked at it for a long moment. "For all the letters," he said, "and all the documents and all the things you write that help people." He paused. "And for whatever you write after those things if you want to." She leaned across the small distance between them and kissed him, and he put his arm around her and pulled her close, and they sat by the fire with the cold, hard December outside and the fire warm and the pen on the table beside her, and she felt the extraordinary, uncomplicated fullness of it, of being in a place where she was known and wanted and valued for exactly what she was. "Jasper," she said into his shoulder, "I want to ask you something." "Ask," he said. "What do you want truly?" "Not the ranch, I know what you want for the ranch, but for your life, when you think about what you want it to look like." He was quiet for a moment, and she felt him considering it carefully, the way he considered things. "I want this," he said. "I want exactly this. The fire and the work and someone to talk to who tells me true things." He paused. "I want what my parents had, which was a real partnership. My mother was as much a part of building this ranch as my father was, even though no one in a legal document ever said so. He said she was his best thinking, which is the most romantic thing I think I ever heard him say." He paused again. "I used to think I would find that, and I was starting to think I would not. And then someone knocked on your door with bad news," Rosa said. "And stayed," he said. "Someone stayed." She lifted her face and looked at him. "I intend to keep staying," she said. "If you want that, Rosa." His voice was very gentle and very certain. "There is nothing I want more." Spring arrived in Colfax County with a rush of grass and runoff from the mountains and the particular wild energy of high country spring that makes everything feel possible. In Santa Fe, Thomas Selden filed the coordinated multi-party challenge on behalf of 6 ranching families, including the Finleys, the Calhouns, and the Mornos, along with 3 other property owners whose documentation Rosa had organized over the winter. The filing attracted attention in the territorial press, which was something Selden had calculated carefully. A case that was visible to the public put a different kind of pressure on both the courts and the Maxwell Company's lawyers. Rosa had written some of the documentation herself, not the legal arguments, that was Selden's work, but the factual narrative of the case, the description of how each family had acquired their land legally and in good faith, how long they had been on it, what they had built there. She wrote it with the clarity and specificity she had been trained to by years of legal work, but also with the warm, precise detail of someone who had actually stood on these properties and knew what they looked like and who lived in them. Selden said it was the best factual brief he had ever received from a non-lawyer. Prout said something similar when she showed him the coordinated filing. He looked at it over his glasses with the expression of someone who is genuinely pleased and slightly astonished and said, "Rosa, I hired you to file deeds. I may have underestimated the scope of the position. You gave me a good education in land law," she said. "You gave yourself that education," he said. "I just provided the library." In March, Jasper rode into Cimarron on a Saturday morning and found her at the land office, which she had not known he was planning to do. She heard his horse in the street and came to the door, and he was standing there in the March sun looking slightly windblown and entirely himself, and she felt the lift of it in her chest that she had come to recognize as what happiness looks like when it is not performing but just there, plain as daylight. He took off his hat. "I have a question," he said. "Come in," she said. "There is coffee." "Not that kind of question," he said. "This kind." He reached into his coat and produced a small ring, silver set with a dark red stone, garnet, she thought, the deep red of good southwestern stone, modest and serious and beautiful. She stood in the doorway of the Cimarron land office with the March wind at her back and looked at the ring and then at him. "You are very direct," she said, but her voice had gone soft. "I am a man who knows what he wants," he said. "I told you that." He paused. "Rosa, will you marry me?" She stepped off the porch and took the ring from his hand and turned it in the March light. The garnet caught the sun and went deep red and warm, and she looked at it and then at him, at this man who had made her coffee when his world was falling apart and called her remarkable when she was just doing her job, and kissed her under bare cottonwoods in winter cold and given her a pen to write what mattered with, and said, "Yes, Jasper, yes." He put the ring on her finger and took her face in both hands and kissed her in the middle of Cimarron's Main Street, with the March wind in their coats and Alderman Prout watching from the land office window with a smile he thought no one could see. They were married in May, at the ranch, under the sky that was bigger than any room. It was a small wedding in the sense of number, and a large one in every other sense. Santos stood with Jasper. Prout gave Rosa away with an emotional dignity that almost cracked twice but held. Mrs. Calhoun's, wife of their fellow rancher, had baked a cake with dried fruit and sweet glaze, and the celebration that followed was the kind that these communities knew how to build from available parts. Music from a fiddle played by one of the ranch hands, food contributed from a dozen households, and the particular warmth of people who live in hard country and know how to mark good things when they come. Rosa wore her best dress, dark blue wool, because she had not had time to obtain anything more formal, and because she was not someone who needed ceremony to feel the weight of a vow. She stood under that enormous sky with Jasper's hands in hers and meant every word she said, and she could see from his face that he meant every word too, and the simplicity of it felt like the most solid ground she had ever stood on. The territorial court's full hearing on the Maxwell Grant coordinated challenge was held in October of 1884, exactly 1 year after Rosa had first ridden out to the Finley ranch. It took 3 days, and Selden argued it with the calm efficiency of someone who has prepared a case down to its last molecule and knows exactly where he is standing. Rosa attended every session, sitting in the galley with her careful notes, watching the legal machinery grind and hoping. The judge was a man named Harrison, 60 years old, with 30 years of territorial legal experience and the reputation for having exactly no patience with bad faith litigation. He asked sharp questions. He questioned the Maxwell Company's lawyers about the basis of their boundary calculations, in a way that suggested he found the answers insufficient. He questioned Selden about the 1872 Surveyor General's letter with an attention that suggested he found the answer considerably more persuasive. On the 4th day, Judge Harrison issued his ruling. The Maxwell Company's claims against all 6 properties in the coordinated challenge were dismissed. The original deeds were confirmed as valid. The Surveyor General's 1872 letter and the corresponding territorial archive records established a clear chain of proper registration that the company had failed to rebut. Furthermore, and this was the part that Selden read aloud to Rosa and Jasper afterward with a rare expression of genuine satisfaction, the court noted that the Maxwell Company's pattern of challenging properly registered deeds represented an abuse of the territorial legal process and ordered the company to pay a portion of the defendant's legal costs. Rosa read the ruling twice. Then she set it down on the table in Selden's office and took a very slow breath. Jasper was watching her. "Are you all right?" he said. "I am better than all right," she said. Her voice was not quite steady. "Your ranch is yours, legally, finally, completely yours." He was quiet for a moment, and she could see what was happening in him, the weight lifting, not all at once but in layers, the way the sky clears after a long storm, the light coming back through from somewhere above. He covered his face with both hands for just a moment. When he lowered them, his eyes were bright. "My father's," he said, "and mine and ours." "Yes," she said, "all 3. He pulled her to him and held her, and she wrapped her arms around him in Selden's book-crowded office with the October Santa Fe light coming through the window, and felt the particular joy of having done something real and good, of having fought for a just thing and won it, of being exactly where she was supposed to be. Selden shook both their hands with the warmth of someone who entered a profession for the right reasons and occasionally gets to remember why. "Go home," he said. "You have a ranch to run." They went home. The ranch in autumn was the most beautiful thing Rosa had seen since she came west. She had now lived through 1 full cycle of seasons in that valley, had watched the cottonwoods along the creek go gold and drop their leaves and come back in the spring with that particular young green that is almost painful in its freshness, had watched the grasses cure and dry and come green again, had watched the cattle grow fat on summer grass and move to winter pasture and come back. She knew the land now the way you know a person you live with, not just the pleasant parts but the difficult ones, the mud in the spring thaw and the dust in August, and the way a north wind could come off the mountains in January and make even a well-built fire seem insufficient. She had come to love it. Not the way you love something in a postcard, but the way you love something that is yours because you have put your hands into it, and your days into it, and your heart into it, and because it holds the bones of people you love, and the plans you have made and the life you are building. She continued her work at the land office through the winter of 1884, riding into Cimarron 3 days a week, and handling the cases that came through, while managing the increasing domestic reality of the ranch on the other 4 days. She had ideas about the office that went beyond filing, ideas about how the county's land record systems could be improved and made more resistant to the kind of challenge the Maxwell Company had attempted, and Prout was open to all of them. She was already, in effect, his deputy, and Prout was a man who understood the way things were, and the way they ought to be and the gap between them. In the spring of 1885, she discovered she was pregnant. She told Jasper on a morning in April when the new calves were in the east pasture, and the cottonwoods were in their young green, and the sky was the color of possibility. She told him in the kitchen over coffee, directly and without ceremony, because that was how they talked to each other, and she did not want to be anything other than herself in this moment. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he crossed the kitchen and took her hands in both of his and stood looking at her with an expression that she did not have a word for, and spent a considerable number of years afterward trying to describe accurately, and never quite could. It contained joy and terror and gratitude and something else, something that looked like the recognition of enormous responsibility taken on with complete willingness. "A child," he said. "A child," she confirmed. He brought her hands to his lips and kissed them, and she felt tears come to her eyes unexpectedly, not from sadness but from the weight of the happiness of it, which can feel, when it is very full, remarkably like the other thing. The summer of 1885 was generous and hot. The cattle did well. The ranch expanded by one more parcel, a 50-acre piece along the South Creek that Jasper had wanted for 2 years, and that finally came available through the legal estate of an elderly rancher who had no heirs. Rosa negotiated the deed transfer herself, using the combined authority of her land office knowledge and her own considerable persuasive capacity, and got it recorded without incident. She reduced her work at the land office as the summer went on, not giving it up entirely, but adjusting the schedule to what was practical. Prout was understanding in the practical way of someone who has had to become pragmatic about things that the law has not yet thought to accommodate, and Rosa had trained the new clerk well enough that the office would not fall apart in her absence. In October, exactly 2 years after she had first ridden out to the Finley ranch with papers that could have taken everything, their son was born. They named him Edmund Thomas Finley, Edmund for Jasper's father and Thomas for Selden, who had been told about the naming, and had sent a letter of congratulations that was formal and warm in equal parts. Edmund arrived in the world on a cool October morning, with the efficiency and apparent determination of someone who had business to attend to, and he was from the beginning a solid, calm, watchful presence, with Jasper's gray-green eyes and Rosa's direct regard. Jasper held him for a long time that first morning, sitting in the chair by the window where the October light came through at the same angle it had come through 2 years before when Rosa had sat across from him at that kitchen table, and he looked at his son with an expression that was quiet and absolute. Rosa watched them from the bed, tired and full of a kind of satisfied wonder that she had not known was available to her, and she thought about the chain of things that had brought her to this room and this morning. A placement advertisement in a Columbus newspaper, a stage ride through Red Mesa country, a 12-mile road on a gray horse, a letter in a saddlebag, and a man who had made her coffee when his world was shaking. She thought, it is extraordinary how life can turn on a single decision, how the thing you do because it is right, and because you can turns out to be the thing that changes everything. Santos came to see the baby and held him with the careful competence of someone who has handled many small things requiring gentleness over a long life, and said something in Spanish that Jasper translated as he says he is a good Finley, which made Rosa laugh. Cal Briggs came with his wife and stood in the doorway looking at Edmund with the expression of someone who has successfully hidden a soft interior behind a weathered exterior for 40 years and is losing the battle. His wife simply took Edmund and held him and said he was fine, and then held him some more. Winter came on, as it always did, with snow on the mountains and ice along the creek edges and the long cold nights that are also their own kind of beauty in the high country. The house was warm. Edmund grew. Rosa worked on a proposal during the quiet months, a document she had been thinking about for a year, and that she now had the time and the clarity to write properly. It was a proposal to the Territorial Land Office in Santa Fe for the standardization of deed registration procedures across all New Mexico counties, a unified system that would close the procedural loopholes that had allowed the Maxwell Company and similar claimants to challenge properly registered deeds. She spent 3 months on it. She consulted Selden and Prout and several other land law practitioners. She wrote it with the precision of legal work and the accessibility of good plain language. She was arguing, essentially, that the kind of injustice that had nearly destroyed 6 Colfax County families and had actually destroyed others should not be possible in a well-administered territory. In March of 1886, she sent the document to the Territorial Office in Santa Fe. In May, Prout showed her a letter from the Surveyor General's office acknowledging receipt and noting that the proposal was under review. In September of that same year, the Territorial Land Office issued a new standardized deed registration protocol that incorporated several of her core recommendations. Prout showed her the official notice when it arrived. He did not say anything for a moment, just watched her read it. Then he said, "They do not put your name on it anywhere." "No," she agreed. The work of useful women was like that, as she had known since she was old enough to notice. The thing got done. The credit went to the office, the committee, the system. "I know it was yours," Prout said, "for what that is worth." "It is worth a great deal," she said honestly, "and the protocol exists. That is what matters." She told Jasper that evening at dinner, Edmund in his high chair working on a piece of bread with intense concentration, and Jasper listened to the whole account and then said, quietly, "You changed how land law works in this territory." "I made a suggestion that was adopted," she said. "Rosa, what? Will you ever just take the thing fully?" he said, with a gentle exasperation that she recognized as love. "You built the counterclaim that kept this ranch. You organized the coalition that changed the Maxwell case from a single property dispute into a pattern challenge. You wrote a land registration protocol that is now territorial law. Take the thing. You deserve to take it." She looked at him across the table, this man who had been calling her remarkable since the second week they knew each other, who looked at what she did and called it clearly what it was, and she felt the particular gift of being accurately seen by someone you love. "I saved the ranch," she said. "You saved the ranch," he said. "And you changed territorial land law. Both things." "Both things," she agreed. Edmund looked at them from his high chair with the calm, evaluating gaze he had inherited from both of them, apparently finding the conversation satisfactory, and returned to his bread. Life on the ranch in the years that followed had the quality of something built to last, which is not the same as something that does not change. It changed constantly, in the ways that good lives do, in the expansion and contraction of daily work, in the seasons of the land, in the growth of their family. 3 years after Edmund was born, a daughter arrived, quick and fierce and vocal where Edmund had been calm, who they named Clara after Jasper's mother, and who from her earliest days demonstrated a preference for the outdoors and for horses, and for getting her own way that Jasper said was entirely Rosa, and Rosa said was entirely the Finley inheritance. Santos taught her to ride when she was 4, with the same patient precision he had used with Jasper, and declared her a natural, which she was. Edmund, at 5, was already fascinated by the ranch accounts, and liked nothing more than to sit with Rosa at the desk in the office and watch her work through figures, asking pointed questions that occasionally required her to explain things she had not planned to explain to a 5-year-old. The land continued to be what it was: real, demanding, beautiful, theirs. Jasper expanded the cattle operation in 1888, bringing in a small partnership with the Mornos, their former fellow litigants, who had become genuine friends through the years of shared legal struggle, to access better markets through Springer when the rail connections improved. Cal Briggs, who had been the ranch's foreman through everything, finally retired in 1889 and moved to Cimarron to live with his daughter, and the goodbye was the kind that contains 30 years of shared work and does not need many words. They hired a young foreman named Rafael Morno, the Morno family's eldest son, 24 years old and as capable as his father and considerably faster, and the operation moved forward. Prout retired from the land office in the spring of 1890. His wife's health had continued to be precarious, and he wanted to be with her without the demands of the office. He called Rosa into his office on his last day and sat behind his desk for the last time and told her that the appointment of the new land office director would be coming from the territorial office in Santa Fe, but that he had submitted a formal recommendation to the Surveyor General's office. "What recommendation?" Rosa asked. "That the position be offered to you," he said. She looked at him. "It is an appointed position," he continued, "not elected. The Surveyor General has authority to appoint the county land director. I have made the case in writing, with documentation of your contributions to the office over the past 7 years, including the registration protocol. I do not know if they will agree. The appointment of a woman to a territorial land director position would be," he paused, "it would be unusual." "It would be unprecedented," she said honestly. "Yes," he said, "but the documentation of your qualifications is irrefutable, and I have made that argument as strongly as I know how to make it." He looked at her over his glasses. "You have earned it, Rosa. You have earned it several times over. I am sorry that the earning takes this much work and the recognition takes this much convincing." She looked at him with something warm and complicated. "Thank you, Alderman, for everything." He waved a hand. "You made my last 7 years at this office considerably more interesting than the previous 20, he said. "Now go home. I expect they will write to you from Santa Fe within the month." They wrote in 6 weeks. The letter was formal and cautiously worded, but its meaning was plain. Rosa Chandler Finley was appointed director of the Colfax County Land Office, effective July 1, 1890, making her the first woman to hold such a position in New Mexico Territory. She read the letter at the kitchen table with Edmund, now 7, looking over her shoulder with the evaluating gaze he brought to everything, and Clara, 5, sitting on the floor trying to convince the border collie, the original one's successor, a younger dog with the same calm intelligence, to wear a hat. "What does it say?" Edmund asked. "It says that your mother has a new job," Rosa said. Edmund read the relevant sentence again more slowly. "Director," he said, "that is the person in charge." "Yes," Rosa said. He considered this. "Good," he said, with the serene confidence of a 7-year-old who has never doubted his mother's capacity for anything. She was still sitting with the letter when Jasper came in from the morning work, muddy and wind-cooled, and she handed it to him without saying anything. She watched his face as he read it. The expression that moved through him was so complete, such a full and unguarded display of joy and pride and love, that she felt it as clearly as if he had said each of those things individually. He looked up. "Director." "Director," she confirmed. He crossed the room, mud and all, and took her face in his hands and kissed her thoroughly and completely, and she laughed against his mouth, and Edmund made a sound of dignified protest at the display, and Clara looked up from the dog and said, "Yuck," with absolute conviction. Rosa Finley, director of the Colfax County Land Office, went to work on July 1, 1890, in the same building where she had filed her first deed 7 years earlier, carrying the silver pen that Jasper had given her their first Christmas and a clear understanding of what she intended to do with the position. She improved the records. She implemented the standardized registration protocols across the county with an efficiency that the territorial office noted approvingly. She made the office more accessible to the Mexican and Hispanic landowners in the county who had previously found the English language bureaucracy an additional barrier on top of the legal complexities, hiring a bilingual clerk and conducting official business in Spanish when the situation required. She handled disputes with the directness and the thoroughness that had characterized her work from the beginning. She also continued to write, not official documents now, but a regular column in the Cimarron newspaper on land law questions for ordinary property owners, written in the plain, accessible language she had always preferred. The column was read widely. Letters came in from across the county. She answered them all. The ranch continued. The cattle thrived. Edmund started at the school in Cimarron at 7 and was reading above his level within the first month and asking his teacher questions that the teacher, a capable young man from Ohio, handled with varying degrees of success. Clara learned to rope at 6, under Santos's guidance. He was nearly 70 now, slow-moving and sharp-eyed, still on the ranch because there was nowhere else he wanted to be. She could also read faster than almost anyone her age and argued with the kind of structured persistence that Rosa recognized as her own inheritance to her daughter, which she privately found entirely satisfying. In the summer of 1892, when Edmund was 9 and Clara 7, a third child arrived. Another son, whom they named Santos after the old man, who was so moved by the honor that he sat very still in his chair for a considerable time, and then said something in Spanish that no one translated, but that everyone in the room understood perfectly. Young Santos was a creature of particular temperament, quieter than Clara, less bookish than Edmund, with a physical ease in the world that seemed inherited from his grandfather's namesake, easy in the saddle, from the first time he sat in one, easy with animals, easy in his body in the way of people who have found the thing they are built for. He would be a rancher, everyone agreed from the time he was 4, not from expectation but from simple observation. He looked at cattle the way Edmund looked at account books, and Clara looked at a problem she had decided to solve. Selden visited the ranch in the spring of 1893, making a sentimental journey north from Santa Fe to see how the case he had won 9 years earlier had settled into real life. He was in his middle 60s now, slower in movement but no less sharp in eye, and he sat on the porch of the Finley Ranch house with coffee and watched the 3 children at various occupations in the yard, Edmund reading under a tree, Clara arguing with a fence post about something, young Santos following the border collie with methodical patience, and said to Jasper and Rosa, with the satisfaction of someone reviewing a long body of work, "I think I may have done my best work in this case." "You did extraordinary work," Rosa said. "I had extraordinary materials to work with," Selden said, with a slight bow of acknowledgement that included both of them. That evening, after Selden had gone to his room, Rosa and Jasper sat on the porch in the May twilight, the mountains dark against the last light, the smell of sage and something blooming carried on the warm air. "I have been thinking," Jasper said. "What have you been thinking?" "About that October morning 10 years ago," he said, "when you knocked on my door." She looked at him in the dim light. His face was as familiar to her now as her own hands, as the ranch kitchen, as the mountains on the horizon, a thing she had learned so completely that its absence would be a hole in the shape of the world. "I was terrified," she said. "I had rehearsed everything I was going to say for 12 miles and I arrived at your door and forgot all of it. "You did not seem terrified," he said. "I am very good at not seeming what I am." He made the sound that was somewhere between a laugh and something warmer. "I know that about you now," he said. 10 years of knowing you and I am still learning new corners." He paused. "I hope that never stops." She took his hand where it lay on the porch railing. His hand was familiar too, the roughness of it, the way his thumb moved when he was thinking. "It will not stop," she said. "We are very interesting people." "We are," he agreed. "Particularly you." They sat in the May evening with the mountains dark and the first stars coming out, and the sounds of the ranch settling around them, a horse in the corral, the distant lowing of cattle from the south pasture, the creak of the house in the warm wind, and Rosa thought about what it meant to stay. She had been sent to deliver bad news. She had done that, as directly and kindly as she knew how. And then she had stayed, because the work needed doing and the man needed help, and because something in her had recognized, without being able to articulate it at the time, that this was where the road she had been traveling had been pointing all along. She had stayed through the legal fight and the Santa Fe journey and the autumn letters and the winter planning and the spring of a decision that had changed the shape of everything. She had stayed through a marriage and 3 children and a new professional title and years of work that had made the county more just and more legible to the people who lived in it. She had stayed through loss. Old Santos had died the previous winter, peacefully, in the bunkhouse he had occupied for 30 years, and they had buried him on the East Rise beside Edmund Finley Sr., 2 men who had built things worth building. She had stayed through grief and through joy and through the ordinary and the extraordinary alike, and the staying had not diminished her. It had, if anything, made her more precisely herself than she had ever been before. She thought, "I came west to be invisible somewhere with more sky. And instead I became visible in the biggest way I could have imagined, not famous, not celebrated, but seen by one man in one kitchen over 1 cup of coffee in the way that lasts." "Jasper," she said. He said, not quite asleep, not quite fully awake, content in the specific way of someone who is exactly where they belong. "Thank you," she said, "for letting me stay." He turned and looked at her with those eyes she had noticed from the first, the color of creek water in summer, and said, "Rosa, you saved my ranch and changed the laws of this territory and raised 3 magnificent children and written more good letters than anyone I have ever known." He paused, and his voice was warm and certain and entirely his. "Staying was the easy part." She laughed softly. The stars were fully out now, brilliant and close in the way of the high country sky, the biggest sky she had ever been under, bigger than any room. "Yes," she said, "I suppose it was." The ranch was quiet and warm and real, and the night came down around them, and they sat on the porch of the house where Jasper had been born, and where their children were growing up, and where the land stretched out for miles in every direction, holding everything they had built, and everyone they had loved, and the Cimarron Range stood dark against the stars, and the creek ran in the distance with the sound of water over stone. And Rosa Chandler Finley held her husband's hand in the May night, and felt the extraordinary completeness of a life that had been made, deliberately and together, from the materials of courage and honesty and love. The road from that porch to this one had been 12 miles and a courtroom in Santa Fe and 1,000 letters and 3 children and a territory's worth of legal work and all the ordinary extraordinary days between. She had ridden out on a gray morning with bad news in a saddlebag, and she had never really left, and she never intended to. That was the whole of it. That was all of it. That was enough. That was everything.